tariffs, there's been a lot of on and off, some inconsistency.
There's no inconsistency. I'm not like a block that just, I won't delay. It's called flexibility. It's not called inconsistency. It's called flexibility.
America is losing its breadbasket. It sounds like the headline of a sensationalist newspaper, but over the past 5 years, 50,000 American farmers have indeed gone out of business. Entire farms have disappeared, leaving behind empty barns, scorched fields, and bankruptcies growing faster than weeds after rain. While Washington continues to butt heads in trade wars, fight over tariffs, and crack down on immigrants, who will harvest the crops if people are afraid to go out into the fields, who will grow corn and cotton if every bushel harvested doesn't even cover the cost of water and fertilizer. The Texas valleys, once a symbol of abundance, are now cracking from drought. But that's just one crack in the picture. Diseases such as black spot are destroying crops in Nebraska, drip lines are drying up in Arizona, and farmers in California are burning their vineyards because it is cheaper to destroy the crop than to pay for harvesting and storage. Banks are demanding loan repayments, and farmers are filing for bankruptcy because they see no way out of the debt trap dug by tariffs and inflation.
That's a 10. That's a good one.
But while America is suffocating under the weight of its own mistakes, there is a country that is quietly filling every vacant piece of the market. Canada, known for hockey and maple syrup, is now signing billion-dollar grain contracts, launching new terminals to ship wheat to Europe and Japan, and recruiting workers from the same American states where people have been left without jobs. Farmers from Texas are moving to Saskatchewan, where the state subsidizes electricity for pumps and insures crops even during droughts. Canadian provinces are handing out visors faster than tractors can clear snow, because in the north they understand that this is their chance to take the place that America itself has left empty.
And police in Italy are investigating possible arson after a fire destroyed more than a dozen Tesla vehicles. Elon Musk is calling the incident at a Rome dealership terrorism. This comes as Tesla has been the target of recent protests around the world.
Imagine that in a few years you walk into a supermarket in Chicago and see wheat with a maple leaf corn from Alberta, and wine that used to be made in California now coming from the Canadian valleys. This is not science fiction. It is already a reality that is gaining momentum every day. While Washington is bogged down in arguments and bureaucracy, Canada is building a future where it will become the new breadbasket of the world. The question is not whether this will happen. The question is whether America will be able to change anything before it is too late.
I think you're going to remember today, it's going to be a free nation that we're dealing with. We're going to have a very free and beautiful nation. It's going to be Liberation Day in America, and it's going to be a day that hopefully you're going to look back in years to come and you're going to say, you know, he was right. This has turned out to be one of the most important days in the history of our country.
Today we'll tell you how the exodus of farmers from the US began, why every farm closure in Iowa and Texas is a victory for Saskatchewan and Manitoba, and why, if you think the food crisis will bypass America, you should reconsider your predictions. We'll show you the numbers, facts, and stories of people who are right now changing the map of global food trade, because one country is losing the war for its future, and another is quietly and systematically taking its place. Stay with us to find out how America could lose its food independence, and why Canada is already prepared to sell it back bread and milk, but on its own terms.
After Trump imposed those sweeping 25% tariffs on aluminum and steel imports, the European Union retaliating with tariffs on up to $28 billion of U.S. goods. Trump making it clear this isn't over, vowing to respond in kind with sweeping retaliatory tariffs early next month.
50,000 American farms have disappeared in 5 years, and no one even understood how it happened. Somewhere in Texas, farmer John Harper ran his hand over the door of his barn for the last time in January 2025, before locking it for good and driving away. His fields were cracked from drought, compounded by tariffs, ICE raids that destroyed his workforce, and endless water and electricity bills that came even when there was nothing to fill the pump with. He is not alone in Iowa, Kansas, Arizona. People like him have counted their debts and realized they can no longer pay for fertilizers, which have risen in price after another trade war for fuel for chemicals, for people who are now harder to find than rain in July. American farms were slowly turning into memories of a past in which there was still hope. Because fear had become the reality. Fear of debt, of raids, of disease, of the fact that every dollar invested would not be returned, and that government aid programs would end as quickly as the moisture in the parched earth.
After weeks of whiplash, Trump threatening tariffs, imposing some and walking back others, many Americans are feeling the uncertainty. In Swisher, Iowa, distillery owner Jeff Quint says it's paralyzing.
The bourbon industry is going to be collateral damage in this tariff war. I don't really think there's any way around that.
And he's not alone. Tonight, the majority of Americans, 61%, now say they disapprove of how the president is handling tariffs. 56% say they disapprove of his handling of the economy overall. But the president has dismissed those concerns tonight, saying he has the right to change course.
In mid-March 2025, when most of the country was celebrating the end of winter, the wind in Nebraska spread black spot spores across 45 counties, and corn, barely sprouted, began to rot in the ground. Farmers called the Department of Agriculture hoping for help, but all they heard was a dry voice on the answering machine informing them of technical difficulties. Across the country, farmers fell victim to a system in which decisions are made slowly and bills come quickly. Within 3 months, the tariffs introduced in January made American wheat and corn uncompetitive on the world market. At the same time, Russian and Argentine wheat was being shipped to Rotterdam, and Manila at prices 30 cents per bushel lower than US prices, and each ton of grain from the US was burdened with an additional cost of $3 per ton in freight and fees demanded by carriers. Against this backdrop, according to a new USDA report, exports of hard red winter wheat were in limbo, leaving elevators in Kansas half empty and farmers with debts they could not cover even by selling their equipment.
We begin with the president's trade war escalating tonight. This evening, the retaliation against the United States, Canada, and the European Union responding quickly, just hours after President Trump's 25% tariff on all steel and aluminum coming into the United States. Canada, the largest supplier of steel to the U.S., slapping new tariffs on $20 billion worth of U.S. goods that are sold in Canada. And the 27 countries of the European Union imposing retaliatory tariffs on up to $28 billion worth of U.S. goods sold in Europe.
In Arizona, farmers were horrified to learn that starting in June, the state would enter a Category 1 water shortage, taking away a third of the water that irrigation farms had become accustomed to. Domestic wells and boreholes were required by law to be shut down if new water taxes were not paid. And even the most stubborn producers of lettuce and alfalfa began to wonder whether they should sow this year. John Harper had a neighbor, a Mexican named Enrique, who had worked on these lands for 15 years, but in June 2025, he was taken away during an icy raid in Yuma, leaving John's field without workers and John without hope. And then came the disease. The day after Arizona declared a water shortage, an outbreak of avian flu broke out at Hickman's family farms, the largest poultry farm in the country, and 6 million chickens were destroyed. Warehouses emptied. Hundreds lost their jobs, and local churches began organizing lines for free meals for families who had once lived stable rural lives.
US President Donald Trump has announced a 25% tariff on all car and light truck imports into the country. It's due to come into effect on April 2nd. Economists and world leaders are warning that it will be a tax on consumers and have a chilling effect on the global economy. But to Americans, Trump paints a rosy picture, predicting that the levies will spur growth.
This pattern repeated itself across America, debt after debt, raid after raid, disease after disease. Every new tax, every new duty was like a millstone around the farmers' necks. Every electricity bill in California, where energy prices rose 127% in 10 years, became another reason to turn off the pump and watch the grapes dry on the vine. And while farms were closing one after another in the United States, leaving behind empty houses and rusting tractors, a completely different story was unfolding just north of the border. Canada began buying up farmers as assets that could be turned into gold. Saskatchewan was handing out visors faster than the snow could melt on the fields where former farmers from Texas and Iowa were moving. The provinces invested in automated drip irrigation systems, giving grants to those willing to move and grow crops on Canadian soil. Canadian farmers signed multi-million-dollar contracts to supply grain to Europe and Japan, filling ships in the port of Vancouver that a year earlier had been loaded in New Orleans. Canada became home to farmers who had lost hope in the US, offering crop insurance and low electricity rates, but kept the pumps running even during the driest July on record.
Ready? The higher the tariff, the more likely it is that the company will come into the United States and build a factory in the United States so it doesn't have to pay the tariff.
That will take many, as you know, that will take many years.
In fact, I'll tell you, there's another theory is that the tariff, you make it so high, so horrible, so obnoxious that they'll come right away. When I do the 10%, 10% is really, first of all, 10% when you collect it is hundreds of billions of dollars. The numbers that you're talking, all reducing our deficit. But really, so there's two ways of looking at a tariff. You can do it as a money-making instrument, or you can do it as something to get the companies. Now, if you want the companies to come in,
official reports from Statistics Canada showed an 18.3% increase in farmers' incomes in just 1 year, while Canadian terminals broke records for grain shipments that Americans could no longer deliver. Programs such as Agri-Food Pilot collected applications from thousands of former American farmers and workers, promising them the stability and support they could not find at home. For John Harper, the decision was obvious. Either he continued to fight windmills, or he packed his bags and moved to Saskatchewan, where he was offered a low-interest loan and crop insurance that would cover losses even in the event of a drought.
With Elon Musk's views on weighing into very much national politics, national elections in Europe. And then on top of that, when you see the backdrop of Tesla upgrading its product line and the impact of them trying to chase more sales at the back end of last year, that means it's short on inventory. It can't necessarily sell as many vehicles or doesn't have as many in stock to sell. So there is that issue there of a confluence of impacts, which means that sales have been falling. Again, the question is how much more that will impact into February as well, given that the back end of last year in 2024, Tesla sales did slip overall.
And while people in the US argue about whether to raise tariffs and build new fences, Canada is quietly becoming the new breadbasket of the world. Every day, when another farm in Iowa closes its gates, another light comes on in a barn in the north, where someone is signing a new contract to supply wheat to Japan or loading grain into the hold of a ship bound for Mexico. The American farm is becoming history, and the Canadian farm is becoming the future. And if anyone thinks this is an exaggeration, let them come to the deserted fields of Texas and look at the for sale signs hanging on every other plot, while on the other side of the border the voices of new farmers can be heard, who are not afraid to look to tomorrow because they know that their tomorrow has already begun. California once proudly called itself America's fruit basket, but in June 2025, that facade began to crack, and the cracks spread faster than the authorities could patch them up. It all started with electricity, which became a luxury even for farmers in the Central Valley. Since 2014, rates have risen by 127%, and every kilowatt pumped into irrigation pumps turned into debts that grew like weeds after a rare rain. Small farms that could still afford irrigation in 2020 were now turning off their pumps and watching as the sun mercilessly dried out their vineyards and almond orchards. Joanna Lopez, a farmer in Kings County, wrote in her notebook in May 2025 that for every box of kiwis she picked, she lost 12 cents. And that was before the electricity and packaging bills came in. Her father once said that the land always gives back to those who are willing to work. But now the land was taking everything from her, even her hope. In the markets of Baltimore and New York, Chilean kiwis were selling for 22 cents apiece, and Mexican avocados filled supermarket shelves, displacing California fruit that had become too expensive for local shoppers. In March 2025, the Wall Street Journal estimated that 90% of all avocados eaten by Americans now come from Mexico, and that figure is growing every month. Farmers in California began destroying vineyards because the cost of harvesting and storing grapes exceeded the price offered by wineries, which were inundated with mountains of unsold bottles of wine after the disastrous 2024 season. The president of Allied Grape Growers, in desperation, recommended that its members destroy up to 50,000 acres in orchards in order to somehow stabilize the market, and behind this decision were the tears of thousands of families who had tended these vines with hope for years. And while California farmers were cutting down their vineyards to cut losses, Canada was strengthening its position in the market. Canadian producers were signing long-term contracts with American retailers, offering stable supplies and prices protected from tariff and energy cost spikes. In the provinces of Saskatchewan and Alberta, new solar-powered grain dryers were built, allowing crops to be preserved in unstable weather and high humidity, giving them an advantage over American farmers who were paying more and more for every kilowatt. Canada purchased equipment from German and Japanese manufacturers, automating farms and reducing dependence on manual labor, which remained one of the largest expenses in the US, especially after new ICE raids and increases in the minimum wage. But the real gap began when Canadians realized that the US was losing not only because of tariffs and electricity prices, but also because of its lack of a unified strategy for the future. While Washington held endless hearings on how to save farmers, Canada quietly inked deals, as reported in the Financial Times, with major retailers in Japan, South Korea, and Mexico to supply grain, corn, and vegetables in volumes that, until recently, were shipped from New Orleans ports. The Port of Vancouver broke a record by handling 29 million tons of grain in 2024, and by mid-25 it was already on track to reach 32 million tons by the end of the season. Every ship loaded in Canada was a symbol of how the North was taking market share from the South, and every contract to ship Canadian wheat to Europe was a nail in the coffin of the American export system, which was suffering from infrastructure wear and tear and high tariffs. While Canadian provinces were handing out grants for automated drip irrigation to save water in a changing climate, Arizona and California farmers were lining up for loans to repair old pumps, without which there was no point even starting to plant. In June 2025, farmers in the Central Valley gathered for a rally outside the PG office, demanding lower electricity rates, but were told that price increases were inevitable due to the company's debts. Among them was 28-year-old Sylvia Carter, who held a sign reading "We Feed America. Give us a chance," and cried when her father said that this might be the last year they would be able to water their fields. Meanwhile, in Canada, the government quietly introduced a new program called Green Ag, providing farmers with cheap financing to switch to solar panels and batteries, which reduced their dependence on external energy and allowed them to sell surplus energy back to the grid, turning farmers into not only food producers but also energy producers. This move strengthened Canada's position as a reliable supplier that could consistently meet its export commitments even in the face of weather disasters. New climate-controlled storage facilities were built in New Brunswick and Prince Edward Island, allowing fruits and vegetables to stay fresh for months, while in California, fruit rotted in the fields due to a lack of workers to harvest it. These two worlds, located just 1,500 kilometers apart, presented contrasting pictures. In the US, farmers were burning their fields to cut losses, while in Canada, farmers were expanding their acreage under government guarantees. Every ton of grain shipped from the Port of Vancouver was another reminder that America was losing control of the food market. Every new Canadian contract with retailers in the US and Europe made farmers in the North more powerful, allowing them to dictate prices that until recently had been set by America. And if anyone thinks this situation will change in the coming years, they should look at how quickly global trade priorities shift when politicians argue and farmers are forced to survive. Because in this battle for food and the future, those who are afraid to act will lose. And while America wastes time arguing, Canada is building its food empire day by day. America, which once fed the world, now risks joining the line for grain itself. When we hear figures like 50,000 farms disappearing from the map in a few years, it seems like just statistics. But behind every number is an empty house, a rusty tractor in a dusty yard, and a barn with no lights on. While farmers in Texas and California are racking their brains over how to pay their water and electricity bills, in the north, in Canada, farmers are striking new deals, signing export contracts, and buying equipment that Americans can no longer afford. Every day of delay in Washington is another chance for Ottawa to strengthen its position. Every new contract with Japanese or European retail chains signed in Saskatchewan or Manitoba takes away a piece of the market that was once considered rightfully American. Canada has carried out a clever but simple operation. It has turned the exodus of American farmers into a strategic resource. When a farmer in Iowa or Texas realizes he can no longer afford water and fertilizer, he sells his land, pays off his debts, and buys a ticket to Saskatchewan, where the state gives him a grant to convert his farm, crop insurance, and cheap electricity. They know that in Canada, their crops will not be left to rot in the fields due to a lack of workers, because the provinces are eager to accept legal labor from Latin America and the US itself through pilot programs where there is no need to fear ICE raids or stricter visa rules. These farmers are starting a new life, and with them, the Canadian economy is gaining the experience, technology, and distribution channels that these people bring with them. Every farmer from the south becomes a brick in the foundation of Canada's food empire. In May 2025, the Port of Vancouver reported record grain shipments, and Canadian elevators reported stocks that exceeded last year's levels by 18%, allowing them to sign fixed-price contracts that American traders had already rejected due to instability. Canada is not just selling grain and corn, it is selling stability, predictability, and long-term supply guarantees. While water prices are rising in the US and tariffs are stifling exports, Canadian farmers are receiving loans at 2% per annum to expand their acreage and build new solar-powered grain dryers, reducing their dependence on fluctuating electricity prices. Ottawa has invested billions in modernizing rail hubs, allowing grain and corn to be shipped quickly to ports and from there to Japan, South Korea, and Mexico, taking contracts away from American ports in New Orleans and Houston.